Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. The Road to Mecca by Muhammad Asad. To purchase this book, kindly check the links in the description. Start of Chapter 2. Beginning of the Road. Section 1. It is nearly evening a few days after my encounter with thirst, when Zad and I arrive at a forlorn little oasis, where we intend to stop for the night. Under the rays of the setting sun the sand hills in the east shine, like iridescent masses of agate with ever-changing pastel shadows, and subdued light reflexes so delicate in color that even the eye seems to do violence to them, as it follows the barely perceptible flow of shadows toward the grayness of growing dusk. You can still see clearly the feathery crowns of the palms, and half hidden behind them the lowly mud-grey houses and garden walls, and the wooden wheels over the well are still singing. We make the camels lie down at some distance from the village, below the palm orchards, unload our heavy saddlebags, and remove the saddles from the animals' hot backs. A few urchins assemble around the strangers, and one of them, a big-eyed little boy in a tattered tunic, offers to show Zad a place where firewood is to be found. And while the two set out on their errand, I take the camels to the well. As I lower my leaded bucket and draw it up filled, some women come from the village to fetch water in copper basins and earthenware pitchers, which they carry free on their heads, with both arms outstretched sidewise and bent upward, so as to balance their loads better, holding the corners of their veils in uplifted hands like fluttering winds. Peace be with thee, O wayfarer, they say. And I answer, and with you be peace and the grace of God. Their garments are black, and their faces, as almost always with Bedouin and village women in this part of Arabia, uncovered so that one can see their large black eyes. Although they have been settled in an oasis for many generations, they have not yet lost the earnest mien of their forefathers' nomad days. Their movements are clear and definite, and their reserve free of all shyness as they wordlessly take the bucket rope from my hands, and draw water for my camels, just as 4,000 years ago that woman at the well did to Abraham's servant when he came from Canaan to find for his master's son Isaac a wife from among their kinsfolk in Padan Aram. He made his camels kneel down without the city by a well of water at the time of the evening, the time that women go out to draw water. And he said, O Lord God of my master Abraham, I pray thee, send me good speed this day, and show kindness unto my master Abraham. Behold, I stand here by the well of water, and the daughters of the men of the city come out to draw water. Let it come to pass that the damsel to whom I shall say, Let down thy pitcher, I pray thee, that I may drink. And she shall say, Drink, and I will give thy camels drink also. Let the same be she that thou hast appointed for thy servant Isaac. And thereby shall I know that thou hast showed kindness unto my master. And it came to pass, before he had done speaking, that behold, Rebekah came out, with her pitcher upon her shoulder. And the damsel was very fair to look upon, a virgin, neither had any man known her. And she went down to the well, and filled her pitcher, and came up. And the servant ran to meet her, and said, Let me, I pray thee, drink a little water of thy pitcher. And she said, Drink, my lord. And she hastened, and let down her pitcher upon her hand, and gave him drink. And when she had done giving him drink, she said, I will draw water for thy camels also, until they have done drinking. And she hastened, and emptied her pitcher into the trough, and ran again unto the well to draw water, and drew for all his camels. This biblical story floats through my mind as I stand with my 2 camels before the well of a little oasis, amidst the sands of the great Nufud, and gaze at the women who have taken the bucket rope from my hands and now draw water for my animals. Far away is the country of Padan Aram and Abraham's time, but these women here, with the power of remembrance their stately gestures have evoked, obliterate all distance of space and make 4,000 years appear as of no account in time. May God bless your hands, my sisters, and keep you secure. And thou too, remain under God's protection, O wayfarer. They reply, and turn to their pitchers and basins to fill them with water for their homes. On my return to our camping place, I make the camels kneel down and hobble their forelegs to prevent them from straying at night. Zad has already lit a fire and is busy making coffee. Water boils in a tall brass coffee pot with a long, curved spout. A smaller pot of a similar shape stands ready at Zad's elbow. In his left hand he holds a huge, flat iron spoon with a handle 2 feet long, on which he is roasting a handful of coffee beans over the slow fire, for in Arabia, coffee is freshly roasted for every pot. As soon as the beans are lightly tanned, he places them in a brass mortar and pounds them. Thereupon he pours some of the boiling water from the large pot into the smaller, empties the ground coffee into it, and places the pot near the fire to let it slowly simmer. When the brew is almost ready, he adds a few cardamom seeds to make it more bitter, for as the saying goes in Arabia, coffee, in order to be good, must be bitter like death and hot like love. But I am not yet ready to enjoy my coffee at leisure. Tired and sweaty after the long, hot hours in the saddle, with clothes clinging dirtily to my skin, I am longing for a bath, and so I stroll back to the well under the palms. It is already dark. The palm orchards are deserted. Only far away where the houses stand, a dog barks. I throw off my clothes and climb down into the well, holding on with hands and feet to the ledges and clefts in the masonry, and supporting myself by the ropes on which the water skins hang, down to the dark water and into it. It is cold and reaches to my chest. In the darkness by my side stand the drawing ropes, vertically tautened by the weight of the large, now submerged skins which in daytime are used to water the plantation. Under the soles of my feet, I can feel the thin trickle of water seep upward from the underground spring that feeds the well in a slow, unceasing stream of eternal renewal. Above me, the wind hums over the rim of the well and makes its interior resound faintly like the inside of a seashell held against the ear, a big, humming seashell such as I loved to listen to in my father's house many, many years ago, a child just big enough to look over the tabletop. I pressed the shell against my ear and wondered whether the sound was always there or only when I held it to my ear. Was it something independent of me, or did only my listening call it forth? Many times did I try to outsmart the shell by holding it away from me, so that the humming ceased, and then suddenly clapping it back to my ear. But there it was again, and I never found out whether it was going on when I did not listen. I did not know then, of course, that I was being puzzled by a question that had puzzled much wiser heads than mine for countless ages. The question of whether there is such a thing as reality apart from our minds, or whether our perception creates it. I did not know it then, but looking back it seems to me that this great riddle haunted me not only in my childhood, but also in later years. as it probably has haunted at one time or another, consciously or unconsciously, every thinking human being. For whatever the objective truth, to every one of us the world manifests itself only in the shape and to the extent of its reflection in our minds, and so each of us can perceive of reality only in conjunction with his own existence. Herein perhaps may be found a valid explanation for man's persistent belief, since the earliest stirrings of his consciousness, in individual survival after death, a belief too deep, too widely spread through all races and times to be easily dismissed as wishful thinking. It would probably not be too much to say that it has been unavoidably necessitated by the very structure of the human mind. To think in abstract, theoretical terms of one's own death as ultimate extinction may not be difficult, but to visualize it, impossible, for this would mean no less than to be able to visualize the extinction of all reality as such. In other words, to imagine nothingness, something that no man's mind is able to do. It was not the philosophers and prophets who taught us to believe in life after death. All they did was to give form and spiritual content to an instinctive perception as old as man himself. I smile inwardly at the incongruity of speculating about such profound problems, while engaged in the mundane process of washing away the grime and sweat of a long day's journey. But, after all, is there always a clearly discernible borderline between the mundane and the abstruse in life? Could there have been, for instance, anything more mundane than setting out in search of a lost camel, and anything more abstruse, more difficult of comprehension, than almost dying of thirst? Perhaps it was the shock of that experience that has sharpened my senses, and brought forth the need to render some sort of account to myself, the need to comprehend, more fully than I have ever done before, the course of my own life. But then I remind myself, can anyone really comprehend the meaning of his own life as long as he is alive? We do know, of course, what has happened to us at this or that period of our lives, and we do sometimes understand why it happened. But our destination, our destiny, is not so easily espied, for destiny is the sum of all that has moved in us and moved us, past and present, and all that will move us and within us in the future. And so it can unfold itself only at the end of the way, and must always remain misunderstood, or only half understood as long as we are treading the way. How can I say at the age of 32 what my destiny was or is? Sometimes it seems to me that I can almost see the lives of two men who I look back at my life. But, come to think of it, are those two parts of my life really so different from one another? Or was there perhaps, beneath all the outward differences of form and direction, always a unity of feeling and a purpose common to both? I lift my head and see the round piece of sky over the rim of the well and stars. As I stand very still, for a very long time, I see how they slowly shift their positions, moving on, so that they might complete the rows upon rows of millions of years which never come to a close. And then, without willing it, I have to think of the little rows of years that have happened to me, all those dim years spent in the warm safety of childhood's rooms, in a town where every nook and street was familiar to me. Thereafter, in other cities full of excitements and yearnings and hopes, such as only early youth can know. Then in a new world among people whose mien and bearing were outlandish at first, but in time brought forth a new familiarity and a new feeling of being at home. Then in stranger and ever stranger landscapes, in cities as old as the mind of man, in steeps without horizon, in mountains whose wildness reminded you of the wildness of the human heart, and in hot desert solitudes, and the slow growth of new truths, truths new to me, and that day in the snows of the Hindu Kush when, after a long conversation, an Afghan friend exclaimed in astonishment, "But you are a Muslim, only you do not know it yourself." And that other day, months later, when I did come to know it myself, and my first pilgrimage to Mecca, the death of my wife, and the despair that followed it, and these timeless times among the Arabs ever since, years of deep friendship with a royal man who with his sword had carved for himself a state out of nothingness, and stopped only one step short of real greatness, years of wandering through deserts and steppes, risky excursions amidst Arabian Bedouin warfare, and into the Libyan fight for independence, long sojourns in Medina, where I endeavored to round off my knowledge of Islam in the Prophet's mosque, repeated pilgrimages to Mecca, marriages with Bedouin girls, and subsequent divorces, warm human relationships, and desolate days of loneliness, sophisticated discourses with cultured Muslims from all parts of the world, and journeys through unexplored regions. All these years of submergence in a world far removed from the thoughts and aims of Western existence. What a long row of years! All these sunken years now come up to the surface, uncover their faces once again, and call me with many voices. And suddenly, in the startled jerk of my heart, I perceive how long, how endless my way has been. You have always been only going and going, I say to myself. You have never yet built your life into something that one could grasp with his hands, and never has there been answer to the question, where to? You have been going on and on, a wanderer through many lands, a guest at many hearths, but the longing has never been stilled, and although you are a stranger no more, you have struck no root. Why is it that, even after finding my place among the people who believe in the things I myself have come to believe, I have struck no root? 2 years ago, when I took an Arab wife in Medina, I wanted her to give me a son. Through his son Talal, who was born to us a few months ago, I have begun to feel that Arabs are my kin as well as my brethren in faith. I want him to have his roots deep in this land and to grow up in the consciousness of his great heritage of blood, as well as culture. This, one might think, should be enough to make a man desirous of settling down for good, of building for himself and his family a lasting home. Why is it, then, that my wanderings are not yet over, and that I have still to continue on my way? Why is it that the life which I myself have chosen does not fully satisfy me? Why is it that I find lacking in this environment? Certainly not the intellectual interests of Europe. I have left them behind me. I do not miss them. Indeed, I am so remote from them that it has become increasingly difficult for me to write for the European newspapers, which provide me with my livelihood. Every time I send off an article, it seems as if I were throwing a stone into a bottomless well. The stone disappears into the dark void, and not even an echo comes up to tell me that it has reached its goal. While I thus cogitate in disquiet and perplexity, half submerged in the dark waters of a well in an Arabian oasis, I suddenly hear a voice from the background of my memory, the voice of an old Kurdish nomad. If water stands motionless in a pool, it grows stale and muddy. But when it moves and flows, it becomes clear. So too man in his wanderings. Whereupon, as if by magic, all disquiet leaves me. I begin to look upon myself with distant eyes, as you might look at the pages of a book to read a story from them. and I begin to understand that my life could not have taken a different course. For when I ask myself, what is the sum total of my life? Something in me seems to answer, you have set out to exchange one world for another, to gain a new world for yourself in exchange for an old one, which you never really possessed. And I know with startling clarity that such an undertaking might indeed take an entire lifetime. I climb out of the well, put on the clean, long tunic which I brought with me, and go back to the fire and to Zed and the camels. I drink the bitter coffee which Zed offers me, and then lie down, refreshed and warm, near the fire on the ground. Section 2. My arms are crossed under my neck, and I am looking into this Arabian night which curves over me, black and starry. A shooting star flies in a tremendous arc, and there another, and yet another, arcs of light piercing the darkness. Are they only bits of broken up planets, fragments of some cosmic disaster, now aimlessly flying through the vastness of the universe? Oh no. If you ask Zed, he will tell you that these are the fiery javelins with which angels drive away the devils, that on certain nights stealthily ascend towards heaven to spy upon God's secrets. Was it perhaps Iblis himself, the king of all devils, who has just received that mighty throw of flame there in the east? The legends connected with this sky and its stars are more familiar to me than the home of my childhood. How could it be otherwise? Ever since I came to Arabia, I have lived like an Arab, worn only Arab dress, spoken only Arabic, dreamed my dreams in Arabic. Arabian customs and imageries have almost imperceptibly shaped my thoughts. I have not been hampered by the many mental reservations which usually make it impossible for a foreigner, be he ever so well versed in the manners and the language of the country, to find a true approach to the feelings of its people, and to make their world his own. And suddenly I have to laugh aloud with the laughter of happiness and freedom, so loud that Zad looks up in astonishment, and my dromedary turns its head toward me with a slow, faintly supercilious movement. For now I see how simple and straight in spite of all its length my road has been. My road from a world which I did not possess to a world truly my own. My coming to this land, was it not in truth a homecoming? Homecoming of the heart that has espied its old home backward over a curve of thousands of years, and now recognizes this sky, my sky, with painful rejoicing. For this Arabian sky, so much darker, higher, more festive with its stars than any other sky, vaulted over the long track of my ancestors, those wandering herdsmen warriors, when thousands of years ago they set out in the power of their morning, obsessed by greed for land and booty, toward the fertile country of Chaldea and an unknown future. That small Bedouin tribe of Hebrews, forefathers of that man, who was to be born in Ur of the Chaldees. That man, Abraham, did not really belong in Ur. His was but one among many Arabian tribes, which at one time or another had wound their way from the hungry deserts of the peninsula toward the northern dreamlands that were said to be flowing with milk and honey, the settled lands of the Fertile Crescent, Syria and Mesopotamia. Sometimes such tribes succeed in overcoming the settlers they found there, and establish themselves as rulers in their place, gradually intermingling with the vanquished people and evolving, together with them, into a new nation, like the Assyrians and Babylonians, who erected their kingdoms on the ruins of the earlier Sumerian civilization, or the Chaldeans, who grew to power in Babylon, or the Amorites, who later came to be known as Canaanites in Palestine and as Phoenicians on the coasts of Syria. At other times, the oncoming nomads were too weak to vanquish those who had arrived earlier and were absorbed by them, or alternatively, the settlers pushed the nomads back into the desert, forcing them to find other pastures and perhaps other lands to conquer. The clan of Abraham, whose original name according to the book of Genesis was Abram, which in ancient Arabic means he of the high desire, was evidently one of those weaker tribes. The biblical story of their sojourn at Ur on the fringe of the desert relates to the time when they found that they could not win for themselves new homes in the land of the twin rivers, and were about to move northwest along the Euphrates towards Haran and thence to Syria. He of the high desire, that early ancestor of mine, whom God had driven toward unknown spaces, and so to a discovery of his own self, would have well understood why I am here. For he also had to wander through many lands before he could build his life into something that you might grasp with your hands, and had to be cast at many strange hurts before he was allowed to strike root. To his all-commanding experience my puny perplexity would have been no riddle. He would have known, as I know it now, that the meaning of all my wanderings lay in a hidden desire to meet myself, by meeting a world whose approach to the innermost question of life, to reality itself, was different from all I had been accustomed to in my childhood and youth. Section 3. What a long way from my childhood and youth in Central Europe to my present in Arabia, but what a pleasant way for remembrance to travel backward. There were those early childhood years in the Polish city of Lvov, then in Austrian possession, in a house that was as quiet and dignified as the street on which it stood, a long street of somewhat dusty elegance, bordered with chestnut trees and paved with wood blocks that muffled the beat of the horses' hoofs and converted every hour of the day into a lazy afternoon. I loved that lovely street with a consciousness far beyond my childish years, and not merely because it was the street of my home. I loved it, I think, because of the air of noble self-possession with which it flowed from the gay center of that gayest of cities toward the stillness of the woods on the city's margin and the great cemetery that lay hidden in those woods. Beautiful carriages would sometimes fly past on silent wheels to the accompaniment of the brisk, rhythmic trap-trap of prancing hoofs, or, if it happened to be winter, and the street was blanketed with foot-deep snow, sledges would glide over it, and steam would come in clouds from the horses' nostrils, and their bells would tinkle through the frosty air. And if you yourself sat in the sledge, and felt the frost rush by and bite your cheeks, your childish heart knew that the galloping horses were carrying you into a happiness that had neither beginning nor end. And there were the summer months in the country, where my mother's father, a wealthy banker, maintained a large estate for his large family's pleasure. A sluggish little stream with willow trees along its banks, barns full of placid cows, a chiaroscuro mysteriously pregnant with the scent of animals, and hay and the laughter of the Ruthenian peasant girls, who were busy in the evenings with milking. You would drink the foaming warm milk straight from the pails, not because you were thirsty, but because it was exciting to drink something that was still so close to its animal source. Those hot August days spent in the fields with the farm hands who were cutting the wheat, and with the women who gathered and bound it in sheaves. Young women, good to look at, heavy of body, full of breast, with hard, warm arms, the strength of which you could feel when they rolled you over playfully at noontime among the wheat stacks. But of course, you were much too young then to draw further conclusions from those laughing embraces. And there were journeys with my parents to Vienna and Berlin, and the Alps and the Bohemian forests, and the North Sea and the Baltic, places so distant that they almost seemed to be new worlds. Every time one set out on such a journey, the first whistle of the train engine and the first jolt of the wheels made one's heart stop beating in anticipation of the wonders that were now to unfold themselves. And there were playmates, boys and girls, a brother and a sister and many cousins, and glorious Sundays of freedom after the dullness, but not too oppressive a dullness, of weekdays in school, hikes through the countryside, and the first surreptitious meetings with lovely girls of one's own age, and the blush of a strange excitement from which one recovered only after hours and hours. It was a happy childhood, satisfying even in retrospect. My parents lived in comfortable circumstances, and they lived mostly for their children. My mother's placidity and unruffled quiet may have had something to do with the ease with which in later years I was able to adapt myself to unfamiliar, and on occasion, most adverse conditions, while my father's inner restlessness is probably mirrored in my own. If I had to describe my father, I would say that this lovely, slim, middle-sized man of dark complexion and dark, passionate eyes was not quite in tune with his surroundings. In his early youth, he had dreamed of devoting himself to science, especially physics, but had never been able to realize this dream and had to content himself with being a barrister. Although quite successful in this profession, in which his keen mind must have found a welcoming challenge, he never reconciled himself to it fully, and the air of loneliness that surrounded him may have been caused by an ever present awareness that his true calling had eluded him. His father had been an Orthodox rabbi in Czernowitz, capital of the then Austrian province of Bukovina. I still remember him as a graceful old man with very delicate hands and a sensitive face framed in a long, white beard. Side by side with his deep interest in mathematics and astronomy, which he studied in his spare time throughout his life, he was one of the best chess players of the district. This was probably the basis of his long-standing friendship with the Greek Orthodox Archbishop, himself a chess player of note. The two would spend many an evening together over the chessboard, and would round off their sessions by discussing the metaphysical propositions of their respective religions. One might have presumed that, with such a bent of mind, my grandfather would have welcomed his son's, my father's, inclination toward science. But apparently he had made up his mind from the very start that his eldest son would continue the rabbinical tradition which went back in the family for several generations, and refused even to consider any other career for my father. In this resolve, he may have been strengthened by a disreputable skeleton in the family cupboard, the memory of an uncle of his, that is a great uncle of mine, who had in the most unusual way betrayed the family tradition, and even turned away from the religion of his forefathers. That almost mythical great uncle, whose name was never mentioned aloud, seems to have been brought up in the same strict family tradition. At a very young age, he had become a full-fledged rabbi, and been married off to a woman whom he apparently did not love. as the rabbinical profession did not bring sufficient remuneration in those days. He supplemented his income by trading in furs, which every year necessitated a journey to Europe's central fur market, Leipzig. One day, when he was about 25 years old, he set out by horse cart. It was in the first half of the 19th century on one of these long journeys. In Leipzig, he sold his furs as usual, but instead of returning to his hometown as usual, he sold the cart and the horse as well, shaved off his beard and side locks, and forgetting his unloved wife, went to England. For a time, he earned his living by menial work, studying astronomy and mathematics in the evening. Some patron seems to have recognized his mental gifts and enabled him to pursue his studies at Oxford, from where he emerged after a few years as a promising scholar and a convert to Christianity. Shortly after sending a letter of divorce to his Jewish wife, he married a girl from among the Gentiles. Not much was known to our family about his later life, except that he achieved considerable distinction as an astronomer and university teacher and ended his days as a knight. This horrifying example seems to have persuaded my grandfather to take a very stern attitude regarding my father's inclination toward the study of Gentile sciences. He had to become a rabbi, and that was that. My father, however, was not prepared to give in so easily. While he studied the Talmud in daytime, he spent part of his nights in studying secretly, without the help of a teacher, the curriculum of a humanistic gymnasium. In time he confided in his mother, although her son's surreptitious studies may have burdened her conscience. Her generous nature made her realize that it would be cruel to deprive him of a chance to follow his heart's desire. At the age of 22, after completing the 8 years course of a gymnasium within 4 years, my father presented himself for the baccalaureate examination and passed it with distinction. With the diploma in one hand, he and his mother now dared to break the terrible news to my grandfather. I can imagine the dramatic scene that ensued, but the upshot of it was that my grandfather ultimately relented and agreed that my father should give up his rabbinical studies and attend the university instead. The financial circumstances of the family did not, however, allow him to go in for his beloved study of physics. He had to turn to a more lucrative profession, that of law, and in time became a barrister. Some years later he settled in the city of Lvov in eastern Galicia and married my mother, one of the four daughters of a rich local banker. There, in the summer of 1900, I was born as the second of three children. My father's frustrated desire expressed itself in his wide reading on scientific subjects, and perhaps also in his peculiar, though extremely reserved, predilection for his second son, myself, who also seemed to be more interested in things not immediately connected with the making of money and a successful career. Nevertheless, his hopes to make a scientist of me were destined to remain unfulfilled. Although not stupid, I was a very indifferent student. Mathematics and natural sciences were particularly boring to me. I found infinitely more pleasure in reading the stirring historical romances of Sienkiewicz, the fantasies of Jules Verne, read Indian stories by James Fenimore Cooper and Karl May, and, later, the verses of Rilke and the sonorous cadences of Also sprach Zarathustra. The mysteries of gravity and electricity, no less than Latin and Greek grammar, left me entirely cold, with the result that I always got my promotion only by the skin of my teeth. This must have been a keen disappointment to my father, but he may have found some consolation in the fact that my teachers seemed to be very satisfied with my inclination toward literature, both Polish and German, as well as history. In accordance with our family's tradition, I received through private tutors at home a thorough grounding in Hebrew religious law. This was not due to any pronounced religiosity in my parents. They belonged to a generation which, while paying lip service to one or another of the religious faiths that had shaped the lives of its ancestors, never made the slightest endeavor to conform its practical life or even its ethical thought to those teachings. In such a society, the very concept of religion had been degraded to one of two things: the wooden ritual of those who clung by habit, and only by habit, to their religious heritage, or the cynical insouciance of the more liberal ones, who considered religion as an outmoded superstition to which one might, on occasion, outwardly conform, but of which one was secretly ashamed, as of something intellectually indefensible. To all appearances, my own parents belonged to the former category, but at times I have a faint suspicion that my father, at least, inclined toward the latter. Nevertheless, in deference to both his father and his father-in-law, he insisted on my spending long hours over the sacred scriptures. Thus, by the age of 13, I not only could read Hebrew with great fluency, but also spoke it freely and had in addition a fair acquaintance with Aramaic, which may possibly account for the ease with which I picked up Arabic in later years. I studied the Old Testament in the original, the Mishnah and Gemara, that is, the text and the commentaries of the Talmud, became familiar to me. I could discuss with a good deal of self-assurance the differences between the Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmuds, and I immersed myself in the intricacies of biblical exegesis, called Targum, just as if I had been destined for a rabbinical career. In spite of all this budding religious wisdom, or maybe because of it, I soon developed a supercilious feeling toward many of the premises of the Jewish faith. To be sure, I did not disagree with the teaching of moral righteousness so strongly emphasized throughout the Jewish scriptures, nor with sublime God consciousness of the Hebrew prophets. But it seemed to me that the God of the Old Testament and the Talmud was unduly concerned with the ritual by means of which his worshippers were supposed to worship him. It also occurred to me that this God was strangely preoccupied with the destinies of one particular nation, the Hebrews. The very build-up of the Old Testament as a history of the descendants of Abraham tended to make God appear not as the creator and sustainer of all mankind, but rather as a tribal deity, adjusting all creation to the requirements of a chosen people, rewarding them with conquests if they were righteous, and making them suffer at the hands of non-believers whenever they strayed from the prescribed path. Viewed against these fundamental shortcomings, even the ethical fervor of the later prophets, like Isaiah and Jeremiah, seemed to be barren of a universal message. But although the effect of those early studies of mine was the opposite of what had been intended, leading me away from, rather than closer to, the religion of my forefathers, I often think that in later years they helped me to understand the fundamental purpose of religion as such, whatever its form. At that time, however, my disappointment with Judaism did not lead me to a search for spiritual truths in other directions. Under the influence of an agnostic environment, I drifted, like so many boys of my age, into a matter-of-fact rejection of all institutional religion. and since my religion had never meant much more to me than a series of restrictive regulations, I felt none the worse for having drifted away from it. Theological and philosophical ideas did not yet really concern me. What I was looking forward to was not much different from the expectations of most other boys: action, adventure, excitement. Toward the end of 1914, when the Great War was already raging, the first big chance to fulfill my boyish dreams seemed to come within grasp. At the age of 14, I made my escape from school and joined the Austrian army under a false name. I was very tall for my years, and easily passed for 18, the minimum age for recruitment. But apparently I did not carry a marshal's baton in my knapsack. After a week or so, my poor father succeeded in tracing me with the help of the police, and I was ignominiously escorted back to Vienna, where my family had settled some time earlier. Nearly 4 years later, I was actually and legitimately drafted into the Austrian army. But by then I had ceased to dream of military glory and was searching for other avenues to self-fulfillment. In any case, a few weeks after my induction, the revolution broke out. The Austrian Empire collapsed, and the war was over. For about 2 years after the end of the Great War, I studied, in a somewhat desultory fashion, history of art and philosophy at the University of Vienna. My heart was not in those studies. A quiet academic career did not attract me. I felt a yearning to come into more intimate grips with life, to enter it without any of those carefully contrived, artificial defenses which security-minded people love to build up around themselves. And I wanted to find by myself an approach to the spiritual order of things which I knew must exist, but which I could not yet discern. It is not easy to explain in so many words what I meant in those days by a spiritual order. It certainly did not occur to me to conceive of the problem in conventional religious terms, or for that matter, in any precise terms whatsoever. My vagueness, to be fair to myself, was not of my own making. It was the vagueness of an entire generation. The opening decades of the 20th century stood in the sign of a spiritual vacuum. All the ethical valuations to which Europe have been accustomed for so many centuries had become amorphous under the terrible impact of what had happened between 1914 and 1918, and no new set of values was yet anywhere in sight. A feeling of brittleness and insecurity was in the air, a presentiment of social and intellectual upheavals that made one doubt whether there could ever again be any permanency in man's thoughts and endeavors. Everything seemed to be flowing in a formless flood, and the spiritual restlessness of youth could nowhere find a foothold. In the absence of any reliable standards of morality, nobody could give us young people satisfactory answers to the many questions that perplexed us. Science said, cognition is everything, and forgot that cognition without an ethical goal can lead only to chaos. The social reformers, the revolutionaries, the communists, all of whom undoubtedly wanted to build a better, happier world, were thinking only in terms of outward social and economic circumstances, and to bridge that defect, they had raised their materialistic conception of history to a kind of new, anti-metaphysical metaphysics. The traditionally religious people, on the other hand, knew nothing better than to attribute to their God qualities derived from their own habits of thought, which had long since become rigid and meaningless. And when we young people saw that these alleged divine qualities often stood in sharp contrast with what was happening in the world around us, we told ourselves, The moving forces of destiny are evidently different from the qualities which are ascribed to God. Therefore, there is no God. And it occurred to only very few of us that the cause of all this confusion might lie perhaps in the arbitrariness of the self-righteous guardians of faith, who claimed to have the right to define God, and by clothing him with their own garments, separated him from man and his destiny. In the individual, this ethical liability could lead either to complete moral chaos and cynicism, or alternatively to a search for a creative, personal approach to what might constitute the good life. This instinctive realization may have been indirectly the reason for my choice of history of art as my main subject at the university. It was the true function of art, I suspected, to evoke a vision of the coherent, unifying pattern that must underlie the fragmentary picture of happenings which our consciousness reveals to us, and which, it seemed to me, could be only inadequately formulated through the conceptual thought. However, the courses which I attended did not satisfy me. My professors, some of them, like Strigovsky and Dvorak, outstanding in their particular fields of study, appeared to be more concerned with discovering the aesthetic laws that govern artistic creation than with barring its innermost spiritual impulses. In other words, their approach to art was, to my mind, too narrowly confined to the question of the forms in which it expressed itself. The conclusions of psychoanalysis, to which I was introduced in those days of youthful perplexity, left me equally, if for somewhat different reasons, unsatisfied. No doubt, psychoanalysis was at that time an intellectual revolution of the first magnitude, and one felt in one's bones that this flinging open of new, hitherto barred doors of cognition was bound to affect deeply, and perhaps change entirely, man's thinking about himself and his society. The discovery of the role which unconscious urges play in the formation of the human personality opened, beyond any question, avenues to a more penetrating self-understanding than had been offered to us by the psychological theories of earlier times. All this I was ready to concede. Indeed, the stimulus of Freudian ideas was as intoxicating to my young mind as potent wine, and many were the evenings I spent in Vienna's cafes, listening to exciting discussions between some of the early pioneers of psychoanalysis, such as Alfred Adler, Hermann Steckel, and Otto Gross. But while I certainly did not dispute the validity of its analytical principles, I was disturbed by the intellectual arrogance of the new science, which tried to reduce all mysteries of man's self to a series of neurogenetic reactions. The philosophical conclusions arrived at by its founder and its devotees somehow appeared to me too pat, too cocksure and oversimplified to come anywhere within the neighborhood of ultimate truths, and they certainly did not point any new way to the good life. But although such problems often occupied my mind, they did not really trouble me. I was never given much to metaphysical speculation or to a conscious quest for abstract truths. My interests lay more in the direction of things seen and felt, people, activities, and relationships. And it was just then that I was beginning to discover relationships with women. In the general process of dissolution of established social mores that followed the Great War, many restraints between the sexes had been loosened. What happened was, I think, not so much a revolt against the straight-lacedness of the 19th century, as rather a passive rebound from a state of affairs in which certain moral standards had been deemed eternal and unquestionable to a social condition in which everything was questionable. a swinging of the pendulum from yesterday's comforting belief in the continuity of man's upward progress to the bitter disillusionment of Spengler, to Nietzsche's more relativism, and to the spiritual nihilism fostered by psychoanalysis. Looking backward on those early post-war years, I feel that the young men and women who spoke and wrote with so much enthusiasm about the body's freedom were very far indeed from the ebullient spirit of ban they so often invoked. Their raptures were too self-conscious to be exuberant, and too easygoing to be revolutionary. Their sexual relations had, as a rule, something casual about them, a certain matter-of-fact blandness which often led to promiscuity. Even if I had felt myself bound by the remnants of conventional morality, it would have been extremely difficult to avoid being drawn into a trend that had become so widespread. As it was, I rather gloried, like so many others of my generation, in what was considered a rebellion against the hollow conventions. Flirtations grew easily into affairs, and some of the affairs into passions. I do not think, however, that I was a libertine, for in all those youthful loves of mine, however flimsy and short-lived, there was always the lilt of a hope, vague but insistent, that the frightful isolation which so obviously separated man from man might be broken by the coalescence of one man and one woman. My restlessness grew and made it increasingly difficult for me to pursue my university studies. At last I decided to give them up for good and to try my hand at journalism. My father, with probably more justification than I was then willing to concede, strongly objected to such a course, maintaining that before I decided to make writing my career, I should at least prove to myself that I could write. And, in any case, he concluded after one of our stormy discussions, a PhD degree has never yet prevented a man from becoming a successful writer. His reasoning was sound, but I was very young, very hopeful, and very restless. When I realized that he would not change his mind, there seemed nothing left but to start life on my own. Without telling anyone of my intentions, I said goodbye to Vienna one summer day in 1920 and boarded a train for Prague. All I possessed, apart from my personal belongings, was a diamond ring which my mother, who had died a year earlier, had left me. This I sold through the good offices of a waiter in Prague's main literary cafe. Most probably I was thoroughly gypped in the transaction, but the sum of money which I received appeared like a fortune. With this fortune in my pocket, I proceeded to Berlin, where some Viennese friends introduced me to the magic circle of littérateurs and artists at the old Café des Westerns. I knew that henceforth I would have to make my way unaided. I would never again expect or accept financial help from my family. Some weeks later, when my father's anger had abated, he wrote to me, "I can already see you ending one day as a tramp in a roadside ditch." To which I replied, "No roadside ditch for me. I will come out on top." How I would come out on top was not in the least clear to me, but I knew that I wanted to write, and was of course convinced that the world of letters was waiting for me with arms wide open. After a few months my cash ran out, and I began to cast about for a job. To a young man with journalistic aspirations, one of the great dailies was the obvious choice, but I found out that I was no choice to them. I did not find it out all at once. It took me weeks of tiresome tramping over the pavements of Berlin, for even a subway or streetcar fare had by then become a problem, and an endless number of humiliating interviews, with editors-in-chief and news editors and sub-editors, to realize that barring a miracle, a fledgling without a single printed line to his credit had not the slightest chance of being admitted to the sacred precincts of a newspaper. No miracle came my way. Instead, I became acquainted with hunger and spent several weeks subsisting almost entirely on the tea and the 2 rolls which my landlady served me in the morning. My literary friends at the Café des Westerns could not do much for a raw and inexperienced would-be. Moreover, most of them lived in circumstances not much different from my own, hovering from day to day on the brink of nothingness and struggling hard to keep their chins above water. Sometimes, in the flush of affluence produced by a luckily placed article or a picture sold, one or another of them would throw a party with beer and frankfurters, and would ask me to partake of the sudden bounty. Or a rich snob would invite a group of us strange intellectual gypsies to supper in his flat, and would gaze at us with awe while we gorged our empty stomachs with caviar canapes and champagne, repaying our host's munificence with clever talk and an insight into bohemian life. But such treats were only exceptions. The rule of my days was stark hunger, and in the nights my sleep was filled with dreams of steaks and sausages and thick slices of buttered bread. Several times I was tempted to write to my father and beg him for help, which he surely would not have refused. But every time my pride stepped in and I wrote to him instead of the wonderful job and the good salary I had. At last a lucky break came. I was introduced to F.W. Murnau, who just then was rising to fame as a film director. This was a few years before Hollywood drew him to still greater fame and to an untimely tragic death. With that whimsical impulsiveness which endeared him to all his friends, at once took a fancy to the young woman who was looking so eagerly and with so much hope in the face of adversity towards the future. He asked me if I would not like to work under him on a new film he was about to begin, and although the job was to be only temporary, I saw the gates of heaven opening before me as I stammered, "Yes, I would." For 2 glorious months, free of all financial worries and entirely absorbed by a host of glittering experiences, unlike anything I had ever known, I worked as Murnau's assistant. My self-confidence grew tremendously, and it was certainly not diminished by the fact that the leading lady of the film, a well-known and very beautiful actress, did not prove averse to a flirtation with the director's young assistant. When the film was finished, and Murnau had to go abroad for a new assignment, I took leave of him with the conviction that my worst days were over. Shortly afterward, my good friend Anton Kuch, a Viennese journalist who had recently come to prominence in Berlin as a theatric critic, invited me to collaborate with him on a film scenario which he had been commissioned to write. I accepted the idea with enthusiasm and put, I believe, much more work into the script. At any rate, the producer who had commissioned it gladly paid the sum agreed upon, which Anton and I divided 50-50. In order to celebrate our entry into the world of films, we gave a party in one of the most fashionable restaurants in Berlin, and when we received the bill, we found that practically our entire earnings had gone up in lobster, caviar, and French wines. But our luck held out. We immediately sat down to writing another scenario, a fantasy woven around the figure of Balzac and a bizarre, entirely imaginary experience of his, and found a buyer on the very day it was completed. This time, however, I refused to celebrate our success and went instead on a several weeks holiday to the Bavarian lakes. After another year full of adventurous ups and downs in various cities of Central Europe, involving all manner of short-lived jobs, I succeeded at last in breaking into the world of journalism. This breakthrough took place in the autumn of 1921, after another period of financial low. One afternoon, while I was sitting in the Café des Westerns, tired and disconsolate, a friend of mine sat down at my table. When I recounted my troubles to him, he suggested, "There might be a chance for you. Dammert is starting a news agency of his own in cooperation with the United Press of America. It will be called the United Telegraph. I am sure that he will need a large number of sub-editors. I'll introduce you to him if you like." Dr. Dammert was a well-known figure in the political circles of Berlin in the 20s, prominent in the ranks of the Catholic Center Party, and a wealthy man in his own right. He enjoyed an excellent reputation, and the idea of working under him appealed to me. Next day my friend took me to Dr. Dammert's office. The elegant, middle-aged man was suave and friendly as he invited us to be seated. "Mr. Fingal," that was my friend's name, "has spoken to me about you. Have you ever worked before as a journalist?" "No, sir," I replied, "but I have had plenty of other experience. I am something of an expert on Eastern European countries and know several of the languages. In fact, the only Eastern European language I could speak was Polish, and I had only the vaguest idea of what was going on in that part of the world. But I was resolved not to let my chance be spoiled by undue modesty." "Oh, that is interesting," remarked Dr. Dammert with a half-smile. "I have a penchant for experts, but unfortunately I can't use an expert on Eastern European affairs just now." He must have seen the disappointment in my face, for he quickly continued, "Still, I may have an opening for you, although it may be somewhat beneath your standing, I wonder." "What is the opening, sir?" I inquired eagerly, thinking of my unpaid rent. "Well, I need several more telephonists." "Oh, no, no, don't worry, not at a switchboard. I mean telephonists to transmit news to the provincial newspapers." This was indeed a come down for my high expectations. I looked at Dr. Dammert, and he looked at me, and when I saw the tightening of the humorous creases around his eyes, I knew that my boastful game was up. "I accept, sir," I answered with a sigh and a laugh. The following week I started my new job. It was a boring job and a far cry from the journalistic career I had been dreaming of. I had nothing to do but transmit by telephone, several times daily, news from a mimeographed sheet to the many provincial newspapers that subscribed to the service. But I was a good telephonist, and the pay was good too. This went on for about a month. At the end of the month an unforeseen opportunity offered itself to me. In that year of 1921, Soviet Russia was stricken by a famine of unprecedented dimensions. Millions of people were starving and hundreds of thousands dying. The entire European press was buzzing with gruesome descriptions of the situation. Several foreign relief operations were being planned, among them one by Herbert Hoover, who had done so much for Central Europe after the Great War. A large-scale action within Russia was headed by Maxim Gorky. His dramatic appeals for aid were stirring the entire world, and it was rumored that his wife would shortly visit the capitals of Central and Western Europe in an attempt to mobilize public opinion for more effective help. Being only a telephonist, I did not participate directly in the coverage of this sensational episode until a chance remark from one of my chance acquaintances, I had many of them in the strangest places, suddenly drew me into its midst. The acquaintance was the night doorman at the Hotel Esplanade, one of Berlin's swankiest, and the remark had been, "This Madame Gorky is a very pleasant lady. One would never guess that she is a Bolshie." Madame Gorky? Where the hell did you see her? My informant lowered his voice to a whisper. She is staying at our hotel. Came yesterday, but is registered under an assumed name. Only the manager knows who she really is. She doesn't want to be pestered by reporters. And how do you know it? We doormen know everything that goes on in the hotel. He replied with a grin. Do you think we could keep our jobs for long if we didn't? What a story it would make to get an exclusive interview with Madame Gorky. The more so as not a word of her presence in Berlin had so far penetrated to the press. I was all at once on fire. Could you, I asked my friend, somehow make it possible for me to see her? Well, I don't know. She is obviously dead set on keeping herself to herself. But I could do one thing. If you sit in the lobby in the evening, I might be able to point her out to you. That was a deal. I rushed back to my office at the United Telegraph. Almost everyone had gone home by that time, but fortunately the news editor was still at his desk. I buttonholed him. Will you give me a press card if I promise to bring back a sensational story? What kind of story? He inquired suspiciously. You give me the press card and I'll give you the story. If I don't, you can always have the card back. Finally, the old news hound agreed, and I emerged from the office, the proud possessor of a card which designated me as a representative of the United Telegraph. The next few hours were spent in the lobby of the Esplanade. At 9 o'clock, my friend arrived on duty. From the doorway he winked at me, disappeared behind the reception desk, and reappeared a few minutes later with the information that Madame Gorky was out. If you sit here long enough, you're sure to see her when she returns. At about 11 o'clock, I caught my friend's signal. He was pointing surreptitiously to a lady who had just entered the revolving door. A small, delicate woman in her middle 40s, dressed in an extremely well-cut black gown, with a long black silk cape trailing on the ground behind her. She was so genuinely aristocratic in her bearing that it was indeed difficult to imagine her as the wife of the working man's poet, and still more difficult as a citizen of the Soviet Union. Blocking her way, I bowed and proceeded to address her in my most engaging tones. Madame Gorky? For an instant she appeared startled, but then a soft smile lightened her beautiful, black eyes and she answered in a German that bore only a faint trace of Slav accent. I am not Madame Gorky. You are mistaken. My name is so and so, giving a Russian-sounding name which I have forgotten. No, Madame Gorky, I persisted. I know that I am not mistaken. I only know that you do not want to be bothered by us reporters, but it would mean a great deal, a very great deal to me to be allowed to speak to you for a few minutes. This is my first chance to establish myself. I am sure you would not like to destroy that chance. I showed her my press card. I got it only today, and I will have to return it unless I produce the story of my interview with Madame Gorky. The aristocratic lady continued to smile. And if I were to tell you on my word of honor that I am not Madame Gorky, would you believe me then? If you were to tell me anything on your word of honor, I would believe it. She burst out laughing. You seem to be a nice little boy. Her graceful head reached hardly to my shoulder. I am not going to tell you any more lies. You win. But we can't spend the rest of the evening here in the lobby. Would you give me the pleasure of having tea with me in my rooms? And so I had the pleasure of having tea with Madame Gorky in her rooms. For nearly an hour, she vividly described the horrors of the famine, and when I left her after midnight, I had a thick sheaf of notes with me. The sub-editors on night duty at the United Telegraph opened their eyes wide on seeing me at that unusual hour. But I did not bother to explain, for I had urgent work to do. Writing down my interview as quickly as I could, I booked, without waiting for editorial clearance, urgent press calls to all the newspapers we served. Next morning the bomb burst. While none of the great Berlin dailies had a single word about Madame Gorky's presence in town, all the provincial papers served by our agency carried on their front pages the United Telegraph Special Representative's exclusive interview with Madame Gorky. The telephonist had made a first-class scoop. In the afternoon, a conference of editors took place in Dr. Dammett's office. I was called in, and after a preliminary lecture in which it was explained to me that no news item of importance ought ever to go out without first being cleared by the news editor, I was informed that I had been promoted to reporter. At last, I was a journalist. Section 4. Soft steps in the sand. It is Zad, returning from the well with the filled water skin. He lets it fall with a plop on the ground near the fire and resumes cooking our dinner. Rice and the meat of a little lamb that he bought in the village earlier in the evening. After a final stir with his ladle and a burst of steam from the pot, he turns to me. Wilt thou eat now, O my uncle? And without waiting for my reply, which he knows cannot be anything but yes, he heaps the contents of the pot onto a large platter, sets it before me, and lifts one of our brass cans, filled with water for me to wash my hands. Bismillah, and may God grant us life. And we fall to, sitting cross-legged opposite each other, and eating with fingers of the right hand. We eat in silence. Neither of us have ever been a great talker. Besides, I have somehow been thrown into a mood of remembrance, thinking of the times that passed before I came to Arabia, before I even met Zad, and so I cannot speak aloud, and speak only silently within myself and to myself, savoring the mood of my present through the many moods of my past. After our meal, as I lean against my saddle, my fingers playing with the sand, and gaze at the silent Arabian stars, I think how good it would be to have by my side someone to whom I could speak of all that has happened to me in those distant years. But there is nobody with me except Zad. He is a good and faithful man, and was my companion in many a day of loneliness. He is shrewd, delicate in perception, and well versed in the ways of man. But as I look sideways at his face, this clear-cut face framed in long tresses, now bent with serious absorption over the coffee-pot, now turning toward the dromedaries which rest on the ground near-by and placidly chew their cud, I know that I need quite another listener. One who not only has had no part in that early past of mine, but would also be far away from the sight and smell and sound of the present days and nights, one before whom I could unwrap the pinpoints of my remembrance, one by one, so that his eyes might see them and my eyes might see them again, and who would thus help me to catch my own life within the net of my words. But there is nobody here but that, and that is the present. End of chapter 2.